Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to be exploring algorithms and the human psyche. With me is Pierre Grimes, a philosopher, founder of the Noetic Institute, and author of Philosophical Midwifery, as well as Socrates and Jesus, a Dialogue Made in Heaven, and many other books. Welcome, Pierre.
Thank you.
Algorithms and the human psyche, it seems like they're almost at opposite poles from each other. Let's begin by examining that word psyche. It's a Greek word originally, and we think of it as the mind or the soul.
Right. But the word can be understood quite simply as the unity of the appetitive element in man, that is what satisfies within ourselves, and the outgoing desire that can be expressed as spirit. And the third part of man is reason. Those three functioning within man collectively is soul. It doesn't say anything about whether it's immortal or immortal. Because in Plato's Republic, the first book, people he's talking with, they say, do you mean to say you think the soul is immortal? So therefore, for a certain element in the Greek world, they hadn't made the connection between existence of soul here and its possible eternal nature.
Now let's just repeat those three elements again. The first one was
what is called the appetitive.
Appetitive?
Yeah. Appetitive.
Appetitive.
Right.
Now, I'm not familiar with that word.
Well, those are the desires that can be satisfied within oneself, one's body. The desires that can be fulfilled by going out to the world, the spirit, or thumos. And then you need, in order to move yourself, reason, because reason is said to be the power in the soul that can motivate the soul to act.
Okay. So once again, the way we can fulfill ourselves, the way we get fulfillment from the external world and reason.
I just had lunch, appetitive. We then engaged in a dialogue downstairs about the future of man. Right? So we're reflecting. And that it causes us to make some action in respect to that. That's the spirit going outward. So that's the way we can consider the activity of man. Okay.
So that's the psyche.
That's the psyche.
And obviously it's a pretty complex business.
Well, I don't know. It's just the three parts.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
We've talked in many of our other conversations about the self.
Right.
How do we distinguish psyche from self?
Each of those are called potential activities. Right? Each of those activities have some goal. The ultimate goal that expresses itself through the intellect, which is the highest form of reason, is the self.
Okay. So in other words, you could say the psyche ultimately is reaching toward selfhood.
Thank you. Well said. Yes, well said.
And of course, that notion of selfhood is sometimes thought of as enlightenment or spiritual realization.
Exactly. Yes, that's true.
Oh, okay. Yes, now, the other half of our conversation, algorithms.
See, the reason the idea of algorithms comes into play is to see whether this idea of philosophical midwifery has any kinship with any modern system of thought. Well, an algorithm as we know in politics today, the whole issue of Russian interference in American elections presupposes that they have a body of data from which they can select, by making an analysis, the key elements that identify certain segments of our population.
Yes.
That can then be addressed to, because of their uniqueness and drives, a corresponding message that benefits themselves.
Which would be true of all advertising.
Yeah, advertising hoped to do that, but now it's systematic.
And propaganda.
That's right. It now makes propaganda an art form.
Yeah.
Before that, it was hit and miss. Or you needed an account executive that had an insight into this kind of population, that kind of population. He was chosen to make that design feature in their activities.
But at an even more basic level, an algorithm is part of any sort of computer program. They all run on algorithms.
That's true. Yes. And what do we mean by that? The ability to identify a particular system that can be said to function autonomously with the most economy of terms and is most effective in analyzing and predicting behavior. Algorithm.
Yep. Okay. In other words, you have an input, very clearly specified, and an output.
That's right.
Once the input, once the algorithm recognizes the input, the output is automatic each and every time.
Right.
So it's mechanical behavior, and we usually think of the psyche as being the opposite of being spontaneous, poetic, romantic, not mechanical.
But when we talk about the kinship of algorithms and the pathologos, pathologos is a false belief about the self.
Now, and we should point out for our viewers, this is a term you coined.
Yes, that's true. I made a new word for the English language.
Pathologos.
Right. Which really means a sick belief of the self.
Yeah.
Right. So that, you see, people consider their behavior in two classes. The way they know they behave in general, and then their own particular way in which they relate to family members. And some people, they react in a similar way and they don't know why they do it. Therefore, there are two systems within man's behavior. One general that he knows, and another puzzling indeed. And we say, that's a puzzle because you haven't gotten behind that erratic behavior, discover the principles operating there.
I mean, occasionally we all surprise ourselves by our own behavior.
A simple example of that is, has anyone ever been in a situation where they act in regard to someone else with anger or immediate suspicion without any evidence for it? That's pathologos.
Now, it could be positive, though, couldn't it?
Well, it is positive. Well, wait a minute. What do you mean?
Let me give you an example. I'm thinking of an example where I surprised myself by my own behavior, but in a positive way.
Oh, that's different.
Okay. That's not pathologos. No. That might be some other higher form of logos.
Quite true.
Okay. So in other words, the pathologos, is, as you point out, it's a sickness. It's something where people usually end up saying, I'm disappointed in myself, I'm embarrassed, I'm ashamed of what I did. It's something you normally have to apologize for.
Perhaps I could give you an example.
Okay.
That occurred to me that started all of this.
Yeah.
All right. I was working at a rehabilitation center in Redwood City in Northern California. And I was the only social worker there. And I was doing that because I was going to graduate school and I needed a job. I had a family, so I was a social worker.
Yeah.
And when they gave me that post, the doctor in charge of it said, Pierre, there's nothing you can do with these people because they're chronic alcoholics.
Yeah.
So whatever you do is fine, just don't cause a problem. So I said, thank you very much. I said, no, I rather understand these people.
Yeah.
He said, it won't work, Pierre. I said, that's okay. So I developed a pattern of approach, and that was I'd go to the blackboard, and when I had one of my periodic alcoholics return, I'd say, well, let's look at your last drunk. What can you recall? And we put it on the board. And I kept saying, there must be something going on here that's significant, because a lot of the behavior is typical of them. And I couldn't understand it. So I said to this fellow who happened to be a PhD in chemistry and went on these binges that were ruinous to his fortune. Yeah. And I said, by the way, do you have any idea what precipitates it? He said, oh, no, it's always, no. He said, well, wait a minute. He said, I'm getting close to a victory. Oh, I said, oh, that's interesting. I said, by chance, what kind of state of mind was that like? Could you describe your feelings at that moment? He said, no, I can't. No, it's something I'm used to. Well, wait a minute. He said, I recall my mother. I was a young boy, maybe 8, and we used to play football, of course, without any garment, without any protective clothing. Yeah. And my mother stood by the door every time I went out to play football, and she'd pat me on the shoulder and she'd say, son, either come home on your shield or with it. And I said, wait a minute. That's a Spartan quote. Wait a minute, where did you get that?
That comes from ancient Greek culture.
Yeah, it's Greek.
Come home on your shield.
or come on with it or on it. Yeah. So I said, what happened? He said, well, many times I'd come back, bruised up.
Yeah.
And I said, well, isn't that interesting? Wait a minute. How do your drunks end? He said, well, as a matter of fact, I'm kind of come home on a stretcher. Oh, you're coming home on your shield. He said, yes, that's right. I said, it looks like you're living out your mother's teaching. I said, why is that? I mean, what was going on?
Yeah.
And he said, well, I really don't know. I said, but wait a minute. That was rather rare because she was very busy during the day with everything. And this was a time when I really got all her attention. I said, how did she look? He sat back and he said, she looked magnificent. She looked beautiful. She looked sincere. She looked like she knew what she was talking about. I was the only person she was relating to, not to my brothers and sisters. I felt like that was a great moment.
Yeah.
So, then how do you connect what she said with appearing so beautiful and sincere and knowledgeable? He said, well, I don't know, but it sure had an effect on me. So I said, good. And he walked away and he came back and he said, I don't think I'm going to be able to go on any more drunks. I said, what happened? He said, I don't know, goodbye.
The therapy was complete at that point. Is that what?
So I said to myself, what is going on?
Yeah.
Is this possible that in a minuscule and one little story, I'm seeing the dynamics of an irrational behavior understood by appealing to a higher principle that's understandable?
Yeah.
That became philosophical midwifery. I stayed with that example for years, and I talked to other people who had problems, and slowly I began to see that that's archetypal. You can use the same approach with the similar questions and gain similar results, and that became what I call philosophical midwifery.
In other words, based on an early childhood experience.
No trauma.
No trauma.
That's important.
But it was an experience that led this individual to, in effect, program themselves to create an algorithm. I know John Lilly wrote this book, Programming and Metaprogramming of the Human Biocomputer, and there is a sense in which if we think that some aspect of the psyche functions as a biocomputer, then it is programmable.
Yes. Now, I was there for several years, you see, and I worked and refined it a bit. And then I did an article, and it turned out to be, I wrote a dialogue with Socrates and Alcibiades.
Uh-huh.
And I used the material that I got in from these people.
Okay.
And I sent it into the Yale Journal. And they sent me back a note, and they said, we can't publish a dialogue. We'll send it to Horizon magazine. 9 months later, I get a letter back, a copy from Yale Journal, and it said, look here, this article, this writing has caused chaos among our staff. Please publish it yourself. We'll be very proud to take a copy of it and put it on our shelves. So that's how the beginning of Philosophical Midwifery became public. That was 65.
Yeah. So there are two issues here.
Yes, yes.
As I see it, the pathologos, the false belief about oneself, functions as an algorithm.
Yes.
And in the case of this individual, how would you characterize his false belief? That he had to please his mother?
That's right. To please his mother. From her words, he saw there were only two possibilities. And he saw that the only way in which he could get that respect was to find himself in a dangerous situation where there's a chance of some kind of victory. Now he took that sense of victory into his own chemistry and his work.
Yeah.
As he became close to a victory in his own work, this game came in, and he went out and lived out that drama as if he was playing ball with his kids. Yeah. Instead, he's going around with other drunks, and they're wasting their life on booze.
So it becomes a mechanical activity, a repeatable pattern that gets triggered.
Correct.
Just like an algorithm.
That's right. And therefore, it's rational. See, before to the subject, it's irrational.
Yeah.
And that's the essential element of complex adaptive systems, that whenever there is anything irrational going on in nature, you have to go for a higher set of principles that can generate insights into it that can then make it understandable. So philosophical midwifery includes both algorithms and chaos theories. CAS.
Because philosophical midwifery, which I think is, it might be fair to say, is a form of psychotherapy that operates based on the principles of, today it's pretty common, cognitive therapy.
Yeah, but see, this came
long before.
Many, many years before, and I'm very glad they're approaching it, and I hope we find the grounds for agreeing on all the elements
of it. Because you've, although you worked as a social worker, your lifetime professional career is that of a philosopher.
Yes. Yes. As a matter of fact, you see, when I had that article, when I finished that article, I said to myself, Pierre, are you a philosopher or are you a psychologist?
Yeah.
So I took that seriously, and I said, you know what? I'm going to see if I can get another PhD in psychology and see what the nature of psychology is. And the New School of Social Research was offering an advanced PhD doctorate, a special doctorate in psychology. And I said, you know, I'm going to go. So I packed up my bags and my children, family, and went to New York and entered New School of Social Research. And I found that they were so primitive that I said, goodbye, gentlemen. As a matter of fact, they were featuring a theory from Goddard and Miller, approach gradient and avoidance gradient. And their study was 50 volunteer paratroopers. They wired them up in order to judge the degree to which they can anticipate anxiety or the level of anxiety. And as they walked up to the plane to make their jump, their scores zoomed up, avoidance.
Yeah.
But they walked up the ladder and jumped. And I turned to the professor of the class. I said, excuse me, that's the end of your theory. It doesn't work. there's something else going on in human behavior, gentlemen.
Mm-hmm.
Because these people should never have jumped.
Because they were full of anxiety.
Yes, and the theory is escape.
Yeah.
So I said, well, goodbye, gentlemen. I'm going to go find a job teaching. And so I wanted to teach so that would give me enough time to do my own work, which is what happened.
Well, you have had a long life, but also a history of being a periodic troublemaker.
Yeah, from my early days.
I recall you told me one story in which a colleague rebuked you for undermining the entire field of psychology.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, at a convention. He came down the stairs and he pointed to me and he said, "Watch out for that man. Mm-hmm. Watch out, he's dangerous, he's satanic." Yeah, I don't think he used the word satanic. I added that.
Diabolic, perhaps?
Diabolic was better, yes. Uh-huh. That's what he said.
Yeah.
You see, that following year, there was a philosophical meeting, an international philosophical meeting, and I presented Philosophical Midwifery to a group, and I asked for volunteers, and a woman came up, and we took her through midwifery, through a great classic problem, and it solved a problem for her. So after I did this presentation before the group, where a woman volunteered to come forward to go through midwifery, which turned out to be preeminently successful, Lou Marinoff, who's a really fine gentleman, scholar up in CCNY, he said, "Pierre, let's start a group." I said, "Good." So
Community College of New York or City College?
Yeah, City College of New York. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he's the professor of philosophy there. So I said, "Wonderful."
Yeah.
So we started this movement, which is now international.
The Philosophical Practitioners Association. So the idea is that philosophers need not be just up in the ivory tower dealing with abstract ideas and what is the meaning of meaning, and but are actually engaged in working with people to solve practical and personal problems.
And that's a return to dialectic.
Yeah.
And that's the ancient Greek art.
And as you pointed out, it is very close to psychotherapy.
That's what I was hoping psychotherapy would recognize the role of mind in human behavior. You see, that's the whole goal.
Yeah.
Because up to this point, in the early days, they were all behaviorists. Yeah. And as you know, they have the idea that the mind is a black box and forget about it.
Yeah. But I started to say earlier that there are two senses in which we're using the word algorithm.
True.
One sense is what you call the pathologos, which is, I know another therapist calls them old tapes. True. Mechanical ways that people behave. We have old tapes, they get triggered, and then we just go into some sort of automatic, almost robotic activity.
That's true.
So there is a sense in which there is a robotic quality to human nature.
I would put it another way. I would say there's a most interesting and profound kind of learning that you can never forget. And it's based upon a belief that you don't know you have made. That's the pathologos.
Uh-huh.
If we could learn other things the way we've mastered the pathologos in one event, we'd have a key to human development.
So, in other words, the identification and transcendence of the pathologos leads to a state of enlightenment, which also leads to greater free will and spiritual freedom.
It gives the opportunity to make that choice. It doesn't lead there. I have known many people, you see, many people looking at it in general are overburdened with their problems. And then when they get a solution to it, then they can work on their dream, their own private dream. And they don't care to go any further into this game.
Yeah.
So it's only those who see in it something significant to their own behavior and to the development of their own mind that take the path that means going towards enlightenment.
I see. I'm going to try and translate what you just said into psychological language that I'm familiar with.
Good.
And that would be Maslow talks about self-actualized person.
Yes.
So a self-actualized person, an Einstein, a Helen Keller, a Eleanor Roosevelt, a person who is out there in the world, fulfilling themselves, helping other people, making great achievements, but they're not necessarily interested in or seeking what we would call spiritual enlightenment.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. But now then, the second way in which I think you're using the term algorithm here is in the process of spiritual midwifery itself.
Right. Right. You see, it took a while in philosophical midwifery before I realized the role of the self. That changed everything, you see. Because now that's a passageway then to understand that there's a more profound self behind dreams. Dreams opened up the realm of the spiritual life of man for me. My own dreams as well as working with other people's dreams. I've never found a dream that was not intelligible. I never found a dream that we couldn't see in it an insight to a person's present problem that they never anticipated uncovering, and which contained in itself the seeds of its own origin. That's a dream.
Well, I think Freud would agree with you on that. He said dreams are the royal road to the unconscious.
Yes. I like to compare, but that's a German philosopher, wasn't it?
Well, he was Austrian, I believe.
Yes, Austrian. Oh, yes, okay. There is that difference, yes, that they like to keep.
But what we're suggesting here is that in the practice of philosophical midwifery, uncovering or helping your client to uncover and achieve a sort of transcendent perspective on their own pathologos, there are certain algorithmic principles that you follow.
Yes, that's true. And see, another important thing is that in my so-called spiritual life, I've attended many meditation retreats over the years and worked with many people who have gained a certain status called enlightenment. In every case, I could see that they still had a pathologos functioning.
Yeah.
That's essential. Enlightenment does not give you an insight into your personal problems. They may reduce their level of intensity, but they still are there. And
in other words, a person could be fully enlightened and still have all kinds of terrible problems they can't escape from?
That's right.
Well, I wouldn't have thought of it that way.
Well, I have known many yogis, roshis, priests, who are very good men, but they still have problems.
Yeah.
See, the problem with priests today, among them are likely to be some very enlightened, fine people. But they haven't dealt with their pathologos.
Well, maybe I would say they're relatively enlightened, or enlightened in some areas and not in others.
Well, that's while you're bringing the word enlightenment is a very interesting term.
Yeah.
In Japanese Buddhism, they have the ox herding pictures. And that ox herding pictures contains 8 degrees of enlightenment. They're all enlightenment.
Yeah.
But they're different depths of profundity to the enlightenment. And it's really only until the 10th, the final, that they can said to be separate themselves from any kind of problem.
Yeah.
So enlightenment is dangerous because it might give the person that they are free. They are free. They can act spontaneously. Yeah. That's true. If you still have a pathologos, you're going to act spontaneously and act out your unthought out problems tied with your pathologos. Oh.
And in fact, I would think a measure of enlightenment might make your pathologos all the more dangerous.
That's the truth.
Now, and I recall a previous conversation we recorded in which you described, we talked about the stink of enlightenment.
Oh, yeah, that's a good term, isn't it? Yeah.
The stench of enlightenment.
Stench of enlightenment.
Yeah, where you had an experience of divine luminosity, and it led you to point out all the flaws you saw in your spouse.
That's right. Always. Matter of fact, you see, that's really interesting. You see, I was at a place where I had this major breakthrough, and I walked out of there without communicating that because it was the last day, the last morning. Enlightenment is very dangerous. Yeah. Like, that was very dangerous. I should have gotten help, and they should have said, "Excuse me, Pierre, watch out now. You're seeing, and you're going to verbalize what you see. You're a danger to yourself and society until you modify it or understand it." So I went back to my family, and we were going to San Diego, and my wife went through a litany of things she often says, and I was writing them down, and I looked and I said, "Oh my God, there are 34 criticisms of me. Why are you doing that?" It started a new way of relating, and she couldn't match it, of course, and I didn't know. I didn't appreciate the fact that I was enlightened. See, there are two kinds. You can have enlightenment which is open and free. It's not divine luminosity.
Yeah.
See, there are two kinds of enlightenment. One is divine luminosity. The other is breaking through in a beautiful clarity of which you're seeing clearly yourself and others.
Well, I would think of that as the need for integration.
Yes, good word.
Example, people who have near-death experiences. I don't know if you know, I worked as a psychotherapist for many years when I lived in California and was licensed there. And I had a client on one occasion who had had a near-death experience. And prior to that time, he had been a typical businessman, which a typical businessman, in my view, is a person who is going to lie and cheat and steal if the opportunity presents itself. It's just considered normal self-interest.
Right.
And not that he's a bad person, but that he had habits of...
And supported by social convention.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he had this near-death experience. He experienced a connection with, as you call it, divine luminosity. But then when he came back, how does he integrate that into all of his old habits, of his old lifestyle? And it began to tear him apart.
That's right.
I've heard of near-death experiencers who struggle, as this person did, for years.
That's right.
To integrate that incredible insight with the habits that they had cultivated living in the material world.
They needed midwifery. Yeah.
And I know one of the things that you point out when you're working with people and they have these insights, they identify the pathologos and maybe how it was engendered by a conversation with some other key person in their life. You recommend that they go back and talk it out with that person.
Yes. And if they can't talk it with that person, do it in the moment with the person you're engaged in. Then with they become a surrogate
the
for
philosophical midwife.
Yes. Yes. Like you say, look here, consider yourself at that very scene and tell me what you know, put it in words, and if you can possibly do that with original members of your family, so much the better, but you should do it now. But see, what does that mean for the human nature? It means that there's a logos that's been interrupted, a false view, which we've been living. Now you have to state that it's false. You have to recognize it's false, communicate the falsehood, so you can back away from it and be free of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's an essential step.
But ultimately, it seems to me it's like a never-ending process.
Well, you're pretty lucky.
Well, how so?
Well, because the deeper you go into your problem, you're beginning more and more profound problems.
Yeah.
See, you can only have fundamentally a finite number of pathologos. Usually, you can say mother and father, sometimes they share the same culture and background,
mm-hmm.
therefore you only have one.
Mm-hmm.
They may come from different, there you have two teachers giving two kinds of teachings.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there are only a finite number of these experiences, and therefore only a finite number of problems. But then you can get the more transcendental problem, which is, okay, now you're doing so well. By the way, what is the self? What is the reach of the mind?
Mm-hmm.
Where does it go? Now you're on a different level. Now they can sit back. They're not in their problem anymore. And now they can face, what do I mean by myself? How can I see it? I come back, I say, look here, keep that question alive in everything you're doing. The repetition of that question, most sincerely put, is going to separate yourself from everything.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to find a separation. What's that which is separated from it?
Mm-hmm.
Which is self. And this is why religious scriptures are so important, like mentioned the Gospel of John the other day, the other talk.
In the beginning was the self.
Yeah. And that magnificent statement,
mm-hmm.
that everything that came to be came through the self,
mm-hmm.
and without the self, nothing came to be. Well, if that's the notion of the self, what would it take to realize that right now in yourself? Now you're on a different plane. Now you're playing a better, more profound game
mm-hmm.
all the time.
Well, what you're suggesting is that when we talk about the self, and I'm going to say with a capital S, the way you're using it here, it's something that existed prior to the creation of the universe. And
That's
will
right.
it continue to exist after the universe itself goes extinct?
And when it goes extinct, it will then reemerge once again and
mm-hmm.
once again, because the total number of possibilities that exist has to be played out.
Mm.
That's all.
Well, what you're saying, Pierre, reminds me of an article I read back many years ago, I think in the 1970s.
Mm.
Ian Stevenson, the psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, who did
mm-hmm.
all this work on reincarnation memories of young children, suggested that psychiatrists could begin to look for the origin of various pathologies, particularly phobias, by looking at past lives. That with the self is not just our present life. It's not just our parents. It may be that we've lived many times before and have developed many automatic forms of behavior, things that we take for granted and don't even know that we do because of past life conditioning.
Yes.
It's a much larger notion of the self.
Yeah. You see, that raises in philosophical midwifery this question. Is there a blank slate? Or do we come into the world with something already presupposed,
mm-hmm.
a certain pattern?
Yep.
Right? What I found is that when you're talking to people who can recollect when they were 2 years old, events,
mm-hmm.
that they already have a way of understanding their world. The way they interpret, the teaching is, there's no relationship between the teaching and what the individual believes. That is to say, there's no relationship between that woman that we talked about who said that. She had no idea that it would follow in her lovely child,
mm-hmm.
the consequences that followed.
Right.
That is to say, she has no idea of how that idea that she's expressing can play itself out.
Yeah, because as you point out, there was no trauma.
No trauma. See, before there's a trauma, there has to be a person's view of themselves, a self-image.
Yeah.
So that we have this kind of curious problem, that these people already have a way of understanding or interpreting their experience. What happens, now we're asking for reincarnation, what happens to that? By that I mean, what happens to past pathologos? Now, I think Homer has a possible answer to that,
Mm-hmm.
because his view of Hades really is that each person that Odysseus interviews when he goes to Hades,
Yes. In the Iliad.
Each one of them presents their problem they had in their former life.
Oh.
There's a string of women, and each one tells them the difficulties they fell for, that they were seduced or raped, and they should have been aware of it, they weren't aware of it, and that's their problem.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are other stories of men.
Well, so in other words, the shades.
The shades
inhabiting Hades they're not just sort of lifeless, flip-flopping things.
No.
In the afterlife, they are endeavoring to resolve their issues.
The other way, that the power of the pathologos is so immense.
Yeah.
It is entirely immense and powerful, that when you die, where does that go?
Yeah.
For Homer, the pathologos goes and becomes the life of the afterworld.
Mm-hmm. But as I recall now from Homer, it became overwhelming. Odysseus had to leave the oracle because all of the shades were flooding in because they had no one else to talk to.
That's right. But hey, the last thing that they told Odysseus is, you make sure, his mother told him, you make sure you tell this to Penelope.
Mm.
Therefore, if he told her all the ways in which men can play games upon women, she knew all the games that men can play to their advantage at her expense.
Mm.
Because Penelope is really one of the great heroes of the Odyssey.
Yes.
Yeah. And her genius brought it all to fruition.
Well, that's another long story. We're going to have to have another session go into the Iliad and the Odyssey in greater detail. But this has been an enlightening conversation, because when we talk about the psyche or the self, and they're related, the self being sort of the penultimate aspect of the psyche, we have to see it as much, much larger than just, this, as your friend Alan Watts would have said, this skin-encapsulated ego.
Yeah, that's true.
Mm-hmm. Well, Pierre Grimes, once again, what a pleasure having this great conversation with you. It's been a joy.
I enjoyed it.
And thank you very much for being with us.
Good for us. Good.